Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Velasina and I am with Scrum.org, and I'm very happy to have Yuval Yeret with us today, one of our professional Scrum trainers, to talk about Scrum from the leader's perspective. Thank you so much for joining. I have a few quick items to go through before we get started. Next slide. Just some very quick guidelines here. So your microphones will be muted throughout, but we highly encourage you to ask questions. So we ask that you use that Q&A button at the bottom right of your screen, and you can click there and enter all of your questions into there as you have them. If you already have questions, you can start popping them in there. We're going to have time for Q&A. And this session is also going to be recorded, and the recording will be available within 24 hours along with the slides. So yeah, we look forward to your questions. Real quick about Scrum.org. Scrum.org was founded by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum, back in 2009. And we offer training and certification on professional Scrum. We're heavily focused on being consistent, and we have global reach, and we have a great community here. And these webinars are a part of that community work that we do. We're really focused on providing learning opportunities outside of the classroom as well, including this webinar, and I hope that this webinar plays a part in your learning journey. So with that, I will hand it over to Yuval to introduce himself and get us started.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm excited to be here. Always fun to see professional Scrum trainers sharing and talking about the nuances of succeeding with Scrum. I've been a professional Scrum trainer since 2017. I, brought Kanban over to the Scrum world. Have been practicing Kanban and Scrum for many years out of Agile Sparks, both in Israel and in the US. I'm based in Boston, and excited to share some of my thoughts based on experiences of what it means to support Scrum and agility from a leadership perspective, which is something that I've been working on for a while. If you'd like to connect and join the conversation, here's where to find me and what I'm talking about. And like Lindsay suggested, please share your questions along the way. Lindsay knows to kind of interject relevant questions as we go to mix things up, and we have plenty of time to talk about questions towards the end. So the topic for today is basically, what does Scrum mean for you as a leader? Or if we are Agile practitioners, what kind of conversations, how should we guide or work, coach, mentor leaders in organizations around their role in Scrum, and I would say generally in supporting agility? There's, supporting the Scrum accountabilities, artifacts, and events, designing effectively for them. There's creating the conditions in which Scrum and agility can thrive. And how can we as leaders leverage Scrum to help us lead effectively? That's generally the topic that I'll talk about today. So let's start with what can we do as leaders to support the Scrum accountabilities, artifacts, and events. And I actually want to start with something that we haven't been talking too much about in the Scrum community recently, which is pigs and chickens, ham and eggs. There are very good reasons why we don't use these metaphors these days. I invite you to take a look at Steve Porter's blog post all the way back to 2011 about this. But I've been thinking as I was preparing for this webcast about the concept of chickens not being committed, and the fact that we are talking about leaders as not being committed, and how poisonous or toxic that has been to some of the Scrum implementations that I've been involved with or looking at from outside. this concept that anybody outside of the Scrum team is only involved, not committed, has been given a license to leaders to stay out of the loop, to not be committed to the success of Scrum. And we've been encouraging that as a community. So I think it's time to change the tune and make sure that leaders understand that for Scrum and agility to really succeed, they do need to be committed to some of the things that I'll be talking about here. For example, if we look at the Scrum events, leaders are asking themselves, leaders might be reading the Scrum Guide, they look at it, and they really feel like, yeah, we're involved in this. What does it have to do with us? And especially they kind of read that they don't need to be there in many of these events. They need to stay out of the sprint retrospective. The daily Scrum is not for them. The team should be doing their sprint planning with their product owner. So at first sense, leaders struggle to understand what is their role. That's what we've tried to address with the Scrum Guide Companion for leaders, to answer questions like, okay, even if I'm not in this event, what can I do to help make this event effective? How can I, as a leader, create the environment that enables empiricism? How can we create an environment where teams, as they're doing, for example, sprint planning, as they're planning their sprint, they're not afraid of commitment. They're not going too granular in their conversations about what needs to happen. They maintain an understanding that it's all about focus and empiricism and having the opportunity to change things along the way. As leaders, we should leverage, for example, the sprint goal more than the sprint backlog. We should leave the sprint backlog to the team. Any attention that we individually as leaders bring to the sprint backlog might cause the team to freeze or to feel like they need it to be perfect and they cannot change it once we looked at it. Let's not do that. What can we do to create an environment where the sprint review is really open, really transparent? Maybe let's come to the team for the sprint review rather than have the team come to us. Sprint reviews that are held in the messy space of the team are often much more effective than going to the boardroom to discuss stuff. So to sum up what we're trying to say here is that the leader's role isn't necessarily to be in the Scrum events, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a role. They do have a role, which is to create the conditions for successful Scrum events. They serve the team, they save the organization by being interested in the feedback and insights generated, as well as how the Scrum events are going in general, and is there anything that they can do to actually make them more effective. This is a way that the leaders can serve when it comes to the Scrum events.
Yuval, you touched a little bit on toxic culture earlier before diving into this section. Someone had asked, Samuel had asked, maybe out of topic, but still, how do you deal with toxic leaders and micromanagers, especially when joining a new organization?
I think the key question is, who are we that are trying to deal with this situation? Are we a Scrum Master that is trying to deal with this? Are we a leader that is trying to deal with this? And the way I'll use this question is not necessarily to answer it, but to say that, leaders are better positioned, or I'll put it differently. If we really want to change a toxic culture, we need to involve leaders in this. That's been my experience.
Right.
As Scrum Masters, our main role is to cause the removal of this sort of impediment, to create the transparency where the organization, first of all, realizes that, the culture is not that healthy, that the culture is maybe toxic. maybe do some cultural assessments, facilitate these conversations, connect things that people are saying to make sure that leaders hear them. And second of all, that we as, let's say, Scrum Masters have a role of facilitating conversation, coaching the organization towards an understanding that this toxic culture is in the way of our business success. And to create an environment where leaders are committed, we go back to that commitment to do something about it, have the courage and openness to acknowledge and do something about this challenge. For me, that's the general perspective on what to do when you have these sort of cultural issues in the organization. It kind of relates to the fact, something we'll talk about later on, which is all of these mechanics that I'm talking about here, this is above the surface of the iceberg. A lot of the leader's role is to use these events, to use the conversations around the artifacts, and later on the conversations about the Scrum accountabilities to have some transparency, some understanding of what's going on underneath the surface. The fact, for example, that the organization struggles to have one product backlog, that people don't feel comfortable with sharing the product backlog with others and want to keep it close to themselves, that's an indication that something smells, something is wrong. Scrum, like Ken used to say, Scrum is like, your mother-in-law, your father-in-law. It keeps pointing out your deficiencies, your flaws. It's painful. It's also true a lot of the time, and you need to do something about it. So when it comes to the artifacts as well are a window into the work of the Scrum team. That's one way that leaders can use them as a way to avoid micromanaging, but to also have transparency to what's going on. Another important thing is the team able to use these artifacts effectively? Are they able to align around a product backlog? How much intervention, how much messing around is there for stakeholders within the product backlog? Is the product owner able to actually own it? Do people misuse the sprint backlog, as we discussed earlier? Do they look for detailed, PMO style work breakdown structures, Gantt charts for the sprint backlog or for the product backlog? Why is that happening, and what do we need to do as leaders to get out of that mode and use these artifacts in a way that enables agility, enables empiricism and self-management and empowerment? Are the teams able to create increments, right? Kind of hiding the increment over here, but crucial question, are the teams able to create done increments? What's in their way? What do they need in order to really succeed? What boundaries do we need to create as leaders? What boundaries do we need to respect as leaders to set up these teams for success? Scrum commitments are also something that we should be using as leaders, that we should coach leaders to use. Whether it's the product goal, that can be a great conversation starter around what do we want the organization to focus on? How do we want to create multiple teams or focus areas in the organization? The negotiation or discussion around what are the product goals we want to focus on, and then what kind of topology we create around it. One of the main things that leaders should be focusing on whenever we're starting a journey towards Scrum or along the way as well. Should be a continuous conversation around what are the product goals. One biotech company that I'm working with is constantly looking at, are our product goals meaningful? Are they creating, teams that actually have agency to deliver valuable stuff? Are they clear to the teams? Are they enabling the teams to make decisions without constantly going back to leaders, which slows them down? As part of scaling your organization, you'll need to figure out what's the right way to slice it or organize it around product goals. As I mentioned earlier, the sprint goal is a much better window into the team's tactical focus without diving too deep into the detail. And the definition of done is a great opportunity for you to discuss quality, professionalism, transparency with the team, while letting them self-manage how do they achieve these goals. Teams should come up with their definition of done, but as leaders, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved in conversations with them about what to try to strive for, what would be ideal, what help do they need to raise their game and improve their definition of done. They might want to do it, but require the time to work on improving automation, for example, or engineering practices. They might need some budget to support some things needed for a stronger sprint level definition of done. There are some things they can do and should be able to do on their own, but we should be very, attentive to what do they need in order to improve. And if things come up that the teams need in order to improve their definition of done, and we don't listen, you can imagine that they will pretty quickly stop trying to improve. On the other hand, if they raise ideas and we jump on these ideas and help them, improve their definition of done or set up the environment where they can improve their definition of done, you better bet they will continue to improve. And in that way, you can see the role of leaders in continuous improvement, in supporting continuous improvement.
Yuval, before we go any further, there are a couple clarifying context setting types of questions in here that would probably be good to set the stage. There are a few people asking what you mean by leader here. Do you mean Scrum Master, since leader is not a role in Scrum? And then there's also a question here, can we agree on the leader role description? What do you mean with the leader role in this presentation? Is it a role or a position? So if you can kind of set that context, I think that would be helpful for the audience.
Yeah. So leader is indeed not a formal accountability in Scrum. And we're keeping it open in the Scrum Guide Companion for Leaders and this presentation to whatever your organizational structure and your definition is. But generally what I'm talking about is people outside of the Scrum team that probably have accountability for the success of an organization that might have multiple Scrum teams. These leaders have a role in or an accountability to support agility or use agility, I would say, to support the success of their organization. And, it's funny that you mentioned the relationship between the Scrum Master and the leader. I'll get back to that. Maybe it will be clearer when we talk about leveraging the Scrum accountabilities. So as that leader that I mentioned, one key thing that we need to work on is who should be taking on each one of the Scrum accountabilities, product owners, developers, Scrum Master, in our context, in our organization. We know it's about accountabilities and not roles. We don't necessarily need to have people that have product owner or developer or Scrum Master as a job title, but we do need to understand who's going to bring that accountability to life in the most effective manner that supports empiricism and self-management. Designing, products, topology, designing teams around them and the accountabilities is a key leadership activity. You can imagine people like engineering managers, CIOs, directors, VPs at different levels that have responsibility for technology organization or any sort of organization that is trying to solve complex problems and is trying to use Scrum and agility as part of that journey. So figuring out, okay, we have that organization. What's the right way to organize it? Do we want to organize it around silos or functions? Do we want to cut across these functions and create cross-functional teams, what we call empowered product teams. How do we do that? Those are all questions that leaders need to be involved with. It doesn't mean they make these decisions alone. But what we do with organizations that we work with is we engage leaders and people in these conversations around what would be the effective topology for the organization. One example such question is who should, be accountable to product ownership? Who should be the product owner for our products? First of all, what are the right products or product goals for our organization? Key conversation related to what's our strategy, how do we want to scale the organization? And we want to keep in mind that a major pitfall of Scrum implementations is when we choose the wrong product owner. When we choose something that is very simple and natural to the organization, it might not be the right choice. Who's going to be the entrepreneur? Who's the right person to be an entrepreneur for this product that we're thinking of? What would it mean to make them the product owner, to have them, take on the product owner accountability? What do we need in order to support them, to create the space where they can actually do that? All of these are things that leaders should be involved with. The Scrum Master, so we talked about developers and how do we organize teams with the right, cross-functional set of developers to really deliver done increments. We talked about product owners. What should we talk about when we're figuring out the Scrum Master accountability? And that might be one of the toughest ones because the Scrum Master is so different than what's currently going on in organizations. It's so tempting to take existing roles like project managers, agile team leads, supervisors, whatever, and make them the Scrum Masters. It's tempting to say, what? There's no easy way to map it. We need Scrum Masters from outside the organization to come and do this for us. And that might actually be, a relevant option, but not necessarily a long-term one. So a lot of leaders don't really worry about this at all. Just, do a check mark and, find some way to implement Scrum Mastery. Good leaders engage with this challenge. Start to think about it. Don't just jump to say, those are the Scrum Masters for our team. Those developers would be Scrum Masters because we need somebody to be accountable to Scrum Mastery. They actually ponder this. They actually think about what's the right solution for this. They experiment with different ways to do this. Maybe people from the teams, maybe people from outside, maybe, I don't know, God forbid, maybe the product owner is the person that is wearing the product owner accountability. Maybe we should try for them to actually have the Scrum Master accountability. Being empirical about things is trying that sort of thing, even though you might read a lot in the, on the Scrum.org blog and from many agile practitioners that, you try to do this thing and things blow up. Don't take it for granted. Try things out. Think about what are you trying to achieve and what's the hypothesis about what would work in your context, and take it from there. Leaders are starting to realize what we're talking about in, the recent Scrum guides. The Scrum Guide for 2020 says Scrum Masters are true leaders who serve the Scrum team and the larger organization. And when we talk about the Scrum Master choices in Scrum Master training, there's a hint here on this visual that we use that says, how does your role as servant leader guide you? It doesn't ask how does your role or your accountability as Scrum Master guide you? Why not? There's something else about switching from role to accountability in the Scrum Guide. It opens up some options for some interesting thinking about Scrum Masters and the relationship between them and servant leaders, leaders. Maybe we'll get back to that. At a minimum, it seems clear, and more, practitioners are talking about it, that on top of these choices that, Scrum Masters and servant leaders should have to deal with different situations that come up day to day, another option is to lead people. Scrum Masters are servant leaders. Sometimes they should actively lead their teams depending on the situation. I want to, pause here and take a step back from focusing on the artifacts, the events, and the accountabilities, and look at the wider picture. But before I do that, Lindsay, are there any questions that you think are worthwhile addressing at this point?
Yeah, there are a bunch that have come in. Sorry, the Zoom panel is jumping around. So this question that came in, how do you influence change and improve output, the value the team produces, without having any authority?
So first of all, I would suggest focusing on improving outcomes rather than outputs.
Right.
If we look at evidence-based management, one of the recent and important bodies of work that Scrum.org published and provides agile leaders is that transition from where measuring velocity and even throughput to that's okay, but the goal is outcomes. Now, to the question around how do we actually influence that, again, it comes to as whom? Who is the person that is trying to influence? As product owners, we can influence it by focusing on the right priorities in the product backlog. Choose the things that would improve outcomes. Enable the team. By the way, even if we're focused on output, ask the team, what do you need in order to improve your output? As leaders, again, ask the team, what do you need in order to create a stronger definition of done? Build quality in, with understanding that by doing that, we reduce waste later on. We're improving our ability to innovate. Invite the team, whether as a leader or a Scrum Master, invite the team to use flow metrics to better understand their ability to deliver in a fast manner, improving, understanding the time to market capabilities of the team and the organization, and where are the constraints or the bottlenecks, where's our constraints or our challenges in innovating. Is it that we're working on too many things? Is it that we're spending too much time supporting earlier releases and most of our customer base is not up on the latest release? Is it that there's too much technical debt? I think that I find that the evidence-based management framework is a great way that we can introduce, whether it's as Scrum Masters or leaders or as developers on the team that are really passionate about this. We want to encourage acts of leadership by everybody in the system, and that's also a leadership role, creating an environment where everybody is passionate about continuous improvement and everybody has a place for actually suggesting ideas. Everybody should be able to point out that, let's have some evidence about what's going on. Let's find the root cause of what's causing, our challenges to deliver value. And with that transparency, we can start to experiment empirically around how to improve. So I'll use that. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Great, thank you. There's actually a follow-on question here that kind of dives into measurement. We could take it now, or we could take it later. What do you think?
Let's take it later. So
Okay, sounds good.
let's use the value of focus. So the bigger picture here is beyond those Scrum events, artifacts, accountabilities. What is the leader's role? The one thing we want to avoid as leaders is to realize, okay, we're committed to this. We're really passionate about this. It's really important to us to drive Scrum across the organization. It's a slippery slope from that understanding and commitment and good intentions about Scrum to mandating Scrum throughout the organization or implementing Scrum and agility using the wrong mindset, the wrong thinking. You can imagine that implementing Scrum using command and control or waterfall thinking might not work that well, because the heart of Scrum is empowerment, self-management, empiricism. Achieving agility in an organization is a great example of a complex problem. We might know what sort of agility we want to achieve. We might think we know how to get there, but we should expect surprises along the way. And when we're expecting surprises both about the destination as well as the path to that destination, we're familiar with an effective approach for how to get there. It's called Scrum, or any sort of other agile approach that applies transparency, inspection, adaptation, and invites people to change rather than mandates. I'll mention David, one of the clients that I work with in a large consumer product goods company. That is, this picture. I used this picture in a recent talk. He's holding the fort. He's holding the organization from jumping all in to Scrum or forcing people to use Scrum. He really believes in Scrum, but he's holding back from telling people you must use Scrum and you must use Scrum this way, because he understands that it's the wrong metaphor, the wrong way of thinking about to drive this sort of change. You need to be patient as a leader. You need to, take a long breath and use the heart of Scrum as a filter for the decisions that you're making about how to use Scrum. There are a lot of things that you do need to consider, a lot of considerations that you will constantly think about as a leader. What's the focus of the work that we're doing in the organization? Where do we have the most complexity, the most challenges? Where is it worthwhile right now to implement Scrum? We don't necessarily force these areas to use Scrum, but maybe we'll spend more of our energy marketing Scrum to these groups and inviting them effectively to use Scrum, setting up an environment where they can. Who does it make sense to have ownership of the problems or products in the organization? So again, what's the right topology? What's the team structure? How does all of that interact with how the organization is set up? People ops, HR, incentives, the way people interact with stakeholders, how stakeholders even show up. What's the culture? We talked earlier about toxic cultures, healthy cultures where it's okay to try, where it's okay to fail and learn, where we celebrate not just success but also learning. All of these are considerations that Agile Scrum leaders should be talking about. They're looking, beyond the teams. They're looking underneath the surface of the iceberg. One important perspective these leaders should have is that, pushing people rarely works. Like this Burger King door, you can have your way and push it as much as you want, whether it be Scrum or any sort of change. But like the door, people are pretty stubborn. So pool works much better. But as a leader, our role is not just to say, yeah, well, you know what, that's reality. We'll wait for people to pull. We're powerless, we're chicken, you know, we can't do anything about it. No, our role is to market these changes, create the environment where they work well. Nurture the conditions where teams would appreciate agility, would desire agility, and where agility would be the easier path for them. Let's look at all of the impediments to agility in the organization and start to move them around. Make agility the path of least resistance for people. Measure the things that would make, you know, teams and people in the organization appreciate agility. Create the environment where people are actually intrinsically motivated to pull Scrum. Make sure that people have the autonomy to choose it, to choose when to use it, how to use it. Create an environment where people are passionate about learning to use Scrum and agility. Don't force people to take on accountabilities that they're not passionate about. That's a major no. So have conversations with people. Market the power and the opportunity of taking on a product owner accountability, a Scrum Master accountability, the opportunity to be a developer on a Scrum team. What's in it for them? Give them the space to learn and get better. Establish the why around why are we doing this? What's the meaning? Make sure that people relate to it. Maybe involve people in creating that why collaboratively. Dave West talks about the heart of Scrum: empiricism, self-management, professionalism. As leaders, we are the stewards of the heart of Scrum in our organizations. Our number one responsibility is to provide the clarity and help ensure that the environment our teams are working, our people are working in, supports the use of Scrum, and not just, you know, at the mechanical level, events, artifacts, and accountabilities, but everything that needs to happen underneath the surface. Are we set up in a way that enables transparency, inspection, adaptation? Are we a culture where people have the courage? Is there stuff that's inhibiting courage or focus or commitment, respect, or openness? Maybe as leaders, have a focus group, run a retrospective around, you know, the Scrum values, empiricism, work with people on what's going well in our culture that we want to reinforce, what's not that great right now that we might want to work on, and be willing to roll up your sleeves and work on some of these things, not just sign checks for people to work on them. Now we get back to that question about the Scrum Master, the leader, what's the relationship between them? What I've seen in organizations these days is that there's more and more conversation, as I think there should be, around the overlap between leaders who serve and the Scrum Master and leaders in the organization, and what does it mean to be a leader versus a manager. It's kind of a controversial thought, which is why not too many people talk about it. Having a person who's potentially having not just influence, but actual authority around, you know, over some of the people on the Scrum teams is considered an anti-pattern or an impediment to actually have that person wear the or be the Scrum Master, have the Scrum Master accountability. But what I've seen is that regardless of who's the Scrum Master, we do need a different sort of leader in organizations for them to succeed. In order for Scrum to succeed in an organization, we do need leaders who serve. We do need leaders who consider these options, these choices, and more often than not, don't just command and control. More often than not, choose to serve and enable, coach, teach, point north, uphold what's important to us, actively do nothing, and rely or create the success for others. This is what servant leadership is about. What better way do we have to bring that to life than to use the concrete role of the Scrum Master, the concrete, accountability of the Scrum Master as a tool that leaders in the organization can use to guide them in the transition towards this sort of servant leadership. There's another advantage to this, which is when leaders take on Scrum Mastery or the Scrum Master accountability for a certain team, or especially if it's a set of teams, a nexus, a group, whatever you want to call it, whatever is the language that you use, they might be better positioned to really set up that team or team of teams for success. That influence that they have, their understanding of the politics, the culture, their network within the organization might be a great asset that enables them to better serve those teams. Yes, they might need some coaching and mentoring on how to actually effectively make these sort of choices. They might not be used to this sort of Scrum Mastery, but what better way to create the interface in which they engage with effective coaching and have these sort of conversations? What is a better way than trying Scrum Mastery on in a certain context? I find in more and more organizations that I work with that we realize that in order to really achieve the change that we want in the organization, we need certain leaders that are passionate about this, that do have the influence in the organization. We need them to engage. Now, maybe it doesn't have to be the Scrum Master accountability. Maybe the future is a different name for this. Maybe it does make sense to split these things up. But I do find that these conversations around the Scrum Master, how it's intertwined with leaders, is a conversation that we should start having more and more, both as a Scrum practitioners community, as well as within organizations that we work with and that we coach. So that's all I have for today. I'll invite you to take a look at, if you're wondering what's the definition of Agile leader, a great place to look is the Agile leader learning path that we have on the Scrum.org site, as well as the professional Agile leadership training class and the Scrum Guide Companion for leaders. I think the combination of these resources would help you establish what's exactly that accountability, how does it map to the work we're doing with Scrum at the team level, and how does it relate to the other accountabilities of Scrum. So with that in mind, Lindsay, let's open the floor to any questions that are out there.
Sounds good. Thanks, Yuval. There are a lot of questions that are coming in, and keep them coming in, and any that we don't get to, we will share with Yuval after this session. This question, hopefully I'm interpreting how this is written correctly. If not, please feel free to correct me, Max. How do you understand the extent to which you need to take the lead over a situation versus letting the team be self-managing?
I'm not just a professional Scrum trainer, I'm also a consultant. And as consultants, we're paid to say it depends. And that's the answer here, right? It really depends. We talk about situational leadership, and what that means is, depending on what's the current situation, you might need to take a lead. And let me move myself here on this visual. This circle that I'm now next to has these different choices. And, like we do in the Scrum Master training, like we do in, Agile leadership training, different situations, different maturities of the team, of the different, accountabilities, people in the different accountabilities around the team, what's currently going on, what's the sense of urgency around the problem that we're trying to solve, might influence or should influence how do we show up to the situation. And I could see a leader one day stepping in and taking action and leading very hands-on, and the next day actively doing nothing, which doesn't mean they do nothing. It means they're very patient, very aware of what's going on, creating the space in which the team self-manages. I hope that helps, Max.
Great, thank you, Yuval. This next question comes in from Don. How can we as Scrum practitioners, regardless of role, reassure traditional hierarchical hierarchical leaders so they are comfortable that they will still get what they need for their non-Scrum roles?
I think the conversation, what I find from experience is the conversation needs to be around what is it that they're looking for. If we use, Agile terms, what's their user story? The why behind the ask. They're looking for Gantt charts. Why? They're looking for dates and commitments. Why? What's the best way to achieve that with how we're working? I find that it's a great conversation to have with these leaders, a concrete conversation with these leaders or stakeholders, to kind of walk them through how we are dealing with these issues. For example, a lot of leaders are looking for predictability. We do provide predictability with Agile and Scrum. It might look different than how they're used to, but we do provide it. It might also be useful to talk about, was there any time where you wanted to change your mind about something, even though, you set out to achieve it? And they typically open up at that point. I think what they're looking for, what I find from experience, what traditional leaders look for, is that concrete conversation that has empathy to their needs, rather than telling them, yeah, you don't understand. You're not relevant anymore. You don't understand this new world. This is how we do things here. So try to avoid, shocking them too much, and try to meet them where they are. Once you meet them where they are, once you start to have empathy to their needs, you probably, have access to the, relevant artifacts, metrics, complementary practices to provide what they need in a way that is not in the way of agility, but actually enables agility.
Great advice there, thanks. Okay, so would you recommend that leaders also get trained in Scrum? And because for them to fully appreciate their role and where to apply their effort as leaders, it would help if they had the knowledge of Scrum. Ta-da!
Yes, my screen is mirrored, so I need to turn the other direction, but definitely. Whether it is the professional Agile leadership essentials, which doesn't talk about Scrum at all, but about Agile leadership, whether it is when I go into an organization let's say, a biotech firm that I'm working with. Leaders of the company, including the leadership team, including the CEO, are part of Scrum training. They were trained together with Scrum Masters and product owners and other leaders in the organization. They were trained in Scrum Mastery and product ownership. They took the PSMPO, which was crucial to have an understanding of everything that I'm talking about here, and to start the conversation around what we're trying to do in the organization. What are our problems? What are our challenges? Where do we want to focus on? What should be our products? How can we have these conversations if these people don't have a solid understanding of Scrum? Whether it's spending 3 days in training or half a day in training, that's for you to figure out. But that's definitely something that that I recommend, and every engagement that I'm on, that's the way we do things.
Great, thanks. This next question: if you are a leader and a Scrum Master, how do you keep your suggestions in a coaching moment from getting interpreted as orders?
One tool that I've learned from coaches that I work with is be explicit about what stance, how are you showing up? So when you move from, coaching to leading, tell the team, I'm moving into coaching. I'm talking as a coach right now. This is my perspective there. When you're moving back into executive action mode, say, okay, I'm moving into executive action here. This is my advice to you. I had a conversation with, another professional Scrum trainer, a coaching conversation recently, and he used that technique very effectively to weave in and out of coaching and advice mode. So definitely something you can try.
Great, thanks. This next question here from Abi. What did you mean earlier by measurement and considering when figuring out how to implement the Scrum Master accountability? Do we need more clarity on that question?
Yeah, I didn't intend to make a direct connection between measurement and the Scrum Master accountability, but I do see measurement as a key tool that Scrum Masters can use. Whoever has the Scrum Master accountability has a role in, providing transparency to the team, to the organization. And the transparency could be provided by measuring things differently than how the organization is currently measuring. For example, measure, the team's happiness with their work, if that's not something that is measured on an ongoing basis. Or if the Scrum Master feels like the team doesn't have enough focus, be sure to measure things like work in process. Maybe set up a Kanban board. If the Scrum Master or a leader feels like the organization is working on too many things, maybe measure the number of teams that each person is on. Or what's the organizational WIP, whether it's using a portfolio Kanban system or whatever approach makes sense to you. But in that sense, measurement helps you point north, helps you coach the team or the organization towards action, or even teach them about the impact of some choices.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. This is a nice one to kind of close with here. What can we do, for example, working with leaders to create a passion for empiricism and evidence-based management in an organization that doesn't have it in its DNA at all, or may have even learned to avoid it?
Lead by example. shine a light on bright spots. Whenever I think about change management, one of my favorite resources is Switch by the Heath brothers. A lot of useful guidance on how to change people's minds, and using bright spots is definitely something you can try. A place where there was courage, where we tried something. Let's celebrate that. Let's look at who are the people that we are promoting. What behaviors are we celebrating? Let's behave this way as leaders. That's kind of why I said there's some influence that you can have at any level in the organization if you want to drive this sort of behavior. But you can see the sort of results that you have on organizational culture when leaders of that organization really believe in that way of working. So you might want to focus on finding, partners, colleagues, people that would help you spread the gospel of this new way of working.
That's good advice there. Okay, so I think we are kind of at our time box for questions here. Yuval, I will share these unanswered ones with you so you can address them on an individual basis or in a blog post, however you want to do that. So everybody, just so you know, I am going to be sharing those so they won't be ignored. And with that, we can move forward and close. Do you have any closing remarks you would like to make, Yuval?
Just that it was lots of fun to talk about this, and I appreciate all the questions. I think we're scheduled to have an Ask Me Anything about this in September, right?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to answer these questions. I love to get questions like this and kind of talk about them afterwards, write about them. I'm not promising to do it over the summer because it's a pretty intensive summer for me, but definitely going into my backlog. So
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for participating and engaging. Hopefully you got some answers to your questions here.
Thank you, Yuval. And I'm gonna just share the link here for anyone interested in joining us for more of a deeper, very focused Q&A session on this topic on September 14th. So there you go. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining today. Please stay connected with Scrum.org through our blog, our forums, and our social media channels. And we hope you got a lot out of this session today. And thank you again, Yuval. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lindsay. It was a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Scrum on.
Scrum on.